June 18th, 2020. The boardroom in Aschheim, Germany is suffocatingly quiet. For days, the executives at Wirecard have been waiting for a single document from the Philippines, a bank statement proving that 1.9 billion euros actually exists. The auditors from EY are refusing to sign off on the annual report. The stock is in free fall, but the tragedy unfolding isn't just about a missing $2 billion. The loss wasn't just in the billions, it was in the total erosion of trust in the European financial establishment. A single lie, compounded over a decade, is about to bring down the continent's most celebrated technology company. To understand how a payment processor built a house of cards massive enough to eclipse Deutsche Bank, you have to look at the architecture of the deception. The glitch in the system wasn't a line of code. It was a fundamental blind spot in global auditing. Wirecard didn't hack a server. They hacked the concept of geographic jurisdiction. In the early 2000s, Wirecard was surviving on the fringes of the internet, processing credit card payments for online gambling and pornography. It was high risk, high margin, and entirely unglamorous. Enter Marcus Braun, a former KPMG consultant with a black turtleneck and a vision to transform this digital backwater into an unstoppable financial technology empire. Braun understood that the market didn't care about the origin of the revenue, only the velocity of the growth. The mechanism they used to manufacture this growth was called third-party acquiring. As Wirecard expanded into Asia and the Middle East, they claimed they didn't have the regulatory licenses to process payments directly, so they outsourced the work to local partners. These third-party companies would handle the transactions, take a cut, and hold the profits in trust for Wirecard on paper. It was a brilliant strategy for rapid asset-light expansion. In reality, it was the perfect black box. Wirecard was booking hundreds of millions of euros in revenue from these partners, but the cash never actually flowed back to Germany. It was allegedly sitting in escrow accounts in places like Singapore and Manila. Here is the maneuver that allowed the fraud to flourish right under the noses of regulators. The third-party revenue wasn't just padding the balance sheet. It was the entire engine of the company's valuation. When auditors asked to see the cash, Wirecard executives, led by Chief Operating Officer John Marsalek, would provide forged letters from obscure Asian banks. Because the money was held in escrow by independent trustees across international borders, the German auditors relied on the word of local auditors, who in turn relied on documents provided by the trustees. It was a circular chain of plausible deniability. The money didn't exist. It was nothing more than a manipulated cell on a spreadsheet, legitimized by the fragmented, localized nature of global financial oversight. By 2018, the illusion had achieved terrifying momentum. Wirecard was added to the DAX, Germany's index of elite blue-chip companies. They were valued at 24 billion euros. Marcus Braun was hailed as a visionary. John Marsalek was flying on private jets, allegedly courting intelligence agencies and moving cash through shadow networks. The corporate narrative was bulletproof, protected by aggressive lawyers and a compliant German financial regulator, BaFin, which actively investigated short sellers and journalists who dared to question the company's accounting. But a fraud of this magnitude requires constant, exhausting maintenance. The Financial Times was publishing granular, devastating exposes on the Asian operations, exposing the third-party partners as empty shell companies registered to residential addresses. The mounting pressure forced Wirecard's supervisory board to commission an independent investigation by KPMG. This was the fatal miscalculation. Braun and Marsalek assumed they could stonewall KPMG just as they had stonewalled everyone else. But when the KPMG report was published in April 2020, it was a bloodbath. The auditors stated plainly that they could not verify the existence of the third-party revenue. The escrow accounts were a mirage. The data trails led to dead ends. The collapse was absolute and violent. Within days of the missing 1.9 billion euros being made public, Marcus Braun was arrested, charged with commercial gang fraud and market manipulation. Jan Marsalek boarded a private plane to Belarus and vanished into the geopolitical ether, becoming one of the most wanted men on earth. Wirecard filed for insolvency, leaving behind billions in debt and a shattered regulatory landscape. The autopsy of the company revealed a staggering failure of oversight. Fiduciary duty was abandoned for the sake of national pride. Regulators, auditors, and institutional investors all chose to look past the glaring anomalies because the illusion of a European tech champion was too profitable to dismantle. The Wirecard collapse stands as a brutal testament to the mechanics of corporate deception. It proved that if a lie is complex enough and the spreadsheets are dense enough, the market will not only believe it, they will finance it. To understand the sheer scale of the deception, one must look at the architecture Marcus Braun constructed. The fraud relied on exploiting the inherent complexity of cross-border digital payments. Braun understood that at a certain scale, money becomes purely theoretical, existing only as data points moving between servers in notoriously opaque jurisdictions. By routing transactions through obscure third-party acquirers in Dubai, Manila, and Singapore, Braun created a labyrinth that defied standard financial oversight. These partners were supposedly processing payments in regions where Wirecard lacked its own regulatory licenses. In reality, they were generating phantom revenue, pumping imaginary profits back into the consolidated balance sheet in Munich to inflate the stock price. This system allowed Braun to project an aura of unstoppable, exponential growth. Every time institutional investors questioned the staggering margins, he pointed to these booming Asian markets, using the friction of international banking laws as a defensive shield. The true weapon of the scheme was not its financial sophistication, but its psychological manipulation of a market desperate for a European tech giant to rival Silicon Valley. The procedural execution of this illusion required relentless, meticulous forgery. Internal whistleblowers eventually exposed that Wirecard operatives were actively backdating contracts, forging executive signatures, and fabricating entire merchant histories out of thin air. They spun up fake email domains for non-existent bank officials, coordinating elaborate digital paper trails designed specifically to survive routine compliance checks. When auditors requested hard proof of funds, the executive team orchestrated a high-stakes shell game. They transferred real corporate cash between various international accounts just in time for quarterly financial snapshots, temporarily filling the gaping holes in their ledgers. The moment the audit snapshot was finalized, the money was quietly wired back out, leaving the offshore escrow accounts completely empty once again. The total failure of the auditing process remains one of the most damning consequences of the scandal. Ernst & Young had signed off on the corporate books for over a decade, repeatedly failing to request direct account statements from the Asian banks supposedly holding the cash. They relied entirely on documents provided by Wirecard itself, abandoning the foundational principle of independent financial verification. This catastrophic oversight shattered the credibility of the German financial regulatory framework. The Federal Financial Supervisory Authority was forced into a humiliating restructuring after it was revealed they had aggressively investigated the financial journalists exposing the fraud rather than the executives committing it. The disaster permanently altered the landscape of European corporate governance, proving that even the most heavily regulated markets remain fatally vulnerable when the watchdogs choose to sleep. On the morning of Friday, March 26, 2021, the risk management desks at the world's most powerful investment banks descended into absolute panic. Phones were ringing across Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Nomura, and Credit Suisse, carrying the exact same apocalyptic realization. A single client operating out of a midtown Manhattan high-rise had quietly built a heavily leveraged, highly concentrated portfolio worth staggering billions, and it was imploding. The loss wasn't just $20 billion evaporating in 48 hours. It was the total exposure of a blind spot so massive it threatened to fracture the global prime brokerage system. The banks were trapped in a high-stakes prisoner's dilemma, realizing they had all been played by a man who had found the ultimate glitch in Wall Street's regulatory machinery. The architect of this silent crisis was Sung-Kook Hwang, known as Bill Hwang. Years earlier, Hwang had run Tiger Asia Management, a highly successful hedge fund that ultimately collapsed under the weight of an SEC investigation into insider trading and market manipulation. Hwang was barred from managing public money. For most, an SEC ban is a career death sentence. For Hwang, it was merely a pivot point. He converted his operation into a family office, managing only his personal wealth under the name Archegos Capital Management. This was the glitch. By structuring Archegos as a family office, Hwang slipped into a regulatory void. He was no longer required to file the standard disclosure forms that force hedge funds to reveal their massive public equity positions. He became a ghost in the machine, armed with a starting capital of roughly $200 million and an insatiable appetite for risk. To turn millions into billions without triggering regulatory tripwires, Hwang deployed a financial weapon known as a total return swap. In a traditional stock purchase, an investor buys shares, owns the voting rights, and if their stake exceeds 5% of a company, they must publicly declare it to the SEC. Archegos bypassed this entirely. Through total return swaps, Hwang paid a fee to prime brokers, the massive banks acting as his enablers. The banks bought the actual shares of companies like Viacom, CBS, and Discovery, holding them on their own balance sheets. Archegos simply collected the profits if the stock went up and paid the difference if it went down. Hwang owned the economic exposure, but not the stock itself. This synthetic leverage allowed Archegos to control vast swaths of the market in absolute secrecy. The brilliance and the ultimate fatal flaw of the Archegos strategy relied on siloing information. Hwang did not just execute these swaps with one bank. He went to half a dozen of the most prestigious prime brokers on Wall Street. He asked each for massive leverage, often putting up only a fraction of the capital required. Because of the family office exemption and the opaque nature of over-the-counter derivatives, none of the banks knew about the others. Credit Suisse believed they were dealing with a moderately leveraged, wealthy client. So did Morgan Stanley. In reality, they were all funding the exact same highly concentrated bets. Archegos was artificially driving up the price of its own target stocks through relentless, leveraged buying across multiple prime brokers. It was a synthetic short squeeze, a self-fulfilling prophecy of upward momentum built entirely on borrowed money and borrowed time. The architecture of this shadow empire required the underlying stock prices to go in only one direction. In late March 2021, the math finally broke. Viacom CBS, seeing its stock price hovering at historic highs, decided to capitalize by announcing a $3 billion secondary stock offering. The market balked. Investors viewed the stock as overvalued, and the share price began to slide. For a normal investor, a 10% dip is a bad day. For Archegos, leveraged to the breaking point through total return swaps, it was a death spiral. The prime brokers, watching the value of the collateral plummet, issued margin calls demanding Archegos deposit billions of dollars in cash immediately to cover the widening losses. Archegos did not have the cash. On Thursday night, Huang's lieutenants convened a frantic, unprecedented conference call with the risk managers of the major prime brokers. The banks finally saw the full picture. They were all holding identical, massive blocks of toxic swaps. If one bank panicked and started liquidating the underlying stocks to recoup their money, the sheer volume of shares hitting the market would crash the price, guaranteeing catastrophic losses for everyone else. They pleaded for a coordinated unwinding, a temporary truce to slowly dismantle the Archegos portfolio without triggering a market panic. But on Wall Street, fiduciary duty to one's own balance sheet always overrides a gentleman's agreement. Goldman Sachs struck first. Before the market opened on Friday, Goldman dumped billions of dollars of Archegos-linked stock in massive block trades, taking a minor haircut but escaping the blast radius. Morgan Stanley followed seconds later. The truce was dead. By the time Credit Suisse and Nomura realized what was happening, the market for those stocks had completely collapsed. The underlying assets were suddenly worth a fraction of the swaps they secured. Nomura lost nearly $3 billion. Credit Suisse, paralyzed by internal risk management failures and bureaucratic hesitation, absorbed a staggering $5.5 billion loss, a blow so severe it fatally wounded the historic institution, paving the way for its eventual collapse and forced acquisition. The wreckage of Archegos Capital Management left behind a crater of destroyed wealth and exposed a terrifying reality about modern financial markets. Bill Huang did not hack a computer system. He exploited the legal definitions of family offices and derivative contracts to turn Wall Street's greed against itself. The prime brokers, blinded by the lucrative fees generated by the swaps, failed to ask the most basic questions about counterparty risk. They handed the keys to the global equity markets to a man with a documented history of market manipulation, simply because the paperwork allowed them to look the other way. It was a masterclass in predatory leverage, proving once again that the most dangerous threats to the financial system do not come from the outside. They are built, funded, and fiercely protected by the system itself. The house of cards finally collapsed under the weight of a routine special audit. KPMG, brought in to silence the growing chorus of skeptics, demanded direct confirmation of the cash balances held in Asian escrow accounts. They were looking for 1.9 billion euros, the supposed bedrock of Wirecard's corporate wealth. Instead of certified bank statements, the auditors were handed crude forgeries, documents so amateurish that the Philippine bank supposedly holding the funds immediately disavowed them. The third-party acquiring partners, the obscure entities that supposedly generated half of Wirecard's revenue and all of its profit, were exposed as digital phantoms. Behind closed doors, the executive board scrambled to maintain the illusion. CEO Marcus Braun released a surreal video statement desperately floating the theory that Wirecard itself was the victim of a colossal multi-billion-euro fraud. He suggested the missing 1.9 billion euros had been siphoned away by shadowy actors in Asia, a final, frantic pivot to deflect from the reality that the money had never existed in the first place. But the procedural safeguards had finally snapped shut. The auditors refused to sign off on the annual report, triggering a catastrophic breach of the company's debt covenants. The financial consequences were immediate and apocalyptic. The moment Wirecard announced the delay of its financial results and admitted the missing funds, the stock chart turned into a cliff face. In a matter of hours, billions of euros in market capitalization evaporated as institutional algorithms and panicked retail traders dumped their shares simultaneously. The highly leveraged financial instruments tied to Wirecard's stock price imploded, triggering margin calls that rippled through the European banking sector. The contagion reached the absolute pinnacle of the German financial establishment. Wirecard was not a fringe startup. It was a member of the DAX 30, the elite index of Germany's most powerful blue-chip companies, sitting alongside titans like Volkswagen and Siemens. To see a DAX component plunge into insolvency was entirely unprecedented, shattering the illusion of European market stability. The index providers were forced into an emergency restructuring, hastily ejecting the disgraced fintech giant to protect the integrity of the broader German stock market. For the investors caught in the blast radius, the financial ruin was compounded by a profound sense of betrayal. Retail shareholders had poured their life savings into Wirecard, convinced by a steady stream of glowing analyst reports and the unwavering defense of the company by BaFin, the German financial regulator. They had believed the narrative of a homegrown technological champion, a rare European success story dominating the digital payments revolution. Instead, they were left holding worthless equity in a sprawling criminal enterprise. The emotional toll extended far beyond the trading floors. Thousands of employees, many of whom had accepted stock options in lieu of higher salaries, watched their financial futures burn to the ground in real time. They had defended the company against the short sellers and the investigative journalists, trusting the executive board's aggressive denials. The realization that their daily labor had been weaponized to prop up a multi-billion-euro Ponzi scheme left a deep, lingering psychological scar across the European tech sector. As the stock price flatlined, the narrative violently shifted from a corporate liquidity crisis to a sprawling criminal autopsy. The Munich public prosecutor's office, having spent years investigating Wirecard's critics, finally turned its sights on the company itself. Marcus Braun was arrested, dressed in a tailored suit, but stripped of his billionaire aura, accused of market manipulation and orchestrating an unprecedented accounting fraud. But the true architect of the illusion, Chief Operating Officer John Marsalek, had already initiated his exit strategy. Under the guise of traveling to the Philippines to track down the missing billions, Marsalek boarded a private jet and simply vanished. The corporate autopsy revealed that the COO was not just a rogue executive, but a highly connected operative with alleged ties to international intelligence agencies and shadow militias. The financial fraud investigation instantly mutated into a global manhunt, exposing a terrifying intersection between white-collar crime, dark money networks, and state-sponsored espionage. Back in the quiet Bavarian suburb of Aschheim, the physical remnants of Wirecard's empire were systematically dismantled. Heavily armed police raided the sprawling glass and steel headquarters, a building designed to project absolute technological supremacy. Now it was a crime scene. Investigators pushed through the silent corridors, packing thousands of physical documents into cardboard boxes and mirroring endless rows of hard drives. The sleek executive suites, once the staging ground for global acquisitions, were stripped of their expensive art and locked down under police seal. Deep inside the building, the server rooms that processed millions of legitimate transactions alongside the phantom Asian revenue hummed in absolute isolation. The flashing blue lights of the server racks illuminated an empty, sterile space, a fitting monument to a company built entirely on synthetic data and fabricated ledgers. The physical infrastructure remained intact, but the corporate entity was completely hollowed out, leaving behind nothing but a digital ghost town and a permanent stain on the global financial system. To understand how a phantom ledger fooled the global financial establishment, you have to look at the architecture of systemic failure. Long before the SEC subpoenas and the perp walks of the modern era, there was a precedent. August 14, 2001, the chief executive officer of the seventh largest company in America abruptly resigns, citing personal reasons. His departure triggers a shockwave across trading floors, but behind the glass walls of a Houston skyscraper, the reality is far more severe. Executives are frantically shredding documents. The company is hemorrhaging cash, and within months, a $65 billion empire will evaporate into thin air. This was hailed as the crown jewel of American innovation. They had transformed from a natural gas pipeline company into a sprawling financial syndicate, trading energy like a Wall Street hedge fund. The architecture of this deception relied on a fundamental glitch in regulatory oversight, a vulnerability exploited with ruthless precision. The tool of choice was mark-to-market accounting. In a standard business model, you record revenue when the cash actually hits your account. But under this new framework, the company could sign a 10-year contract and instantly book the projected decade of profits on that day's balance sheet. If the actual revenue fell short years later, it didn't matter. The executives had already collected their bonuses. It was a corporate heist executed in plain sight, legally sanctioned by the very accounting firms paid to audit them. As the stock price soared, the pressure to maintain the illusion intensified. But booking phantom profits creates a massive problem. It leaves a gaping hole in actual cash flow. To plug that hole, the chief financial officer engineered a shadow banking network of shell companies known as special purpose entities. These offshore vehicles had names straight out of a sci-fi novel, and their sole purpose was to buy the company's toxic assets and bury its mounting debt. By law, a special purpose entity must have at least 3% of its equity owned by independent outside investors to be kept off the main company's balance sheet. But the executives couldn't find legitimate outside buyers for these toxic assets. So they funded the shell companies themselves, backing the debt with shares of their own artificially inflated stock. It was a closed loop of financial fiction. As long as the stock price kept climbing, the shell companies remained solvent and the debt stayed hidden. But the moment the stock price dropped, the entire structure would trigger a margin call, forcing the debt back onto the main balance sheet. The company had effectively collateralized its survival against its own hype. The cracks began to show when the broader market cooled. A handful of aggressive analysts and practitioners of short selling noticed the cash flow didn't match the reported earnings. They started betting heavily against the stock, accelerating the downward pressure. As the share price slipped, the trigger was pulled. The shell companies collapsed under their own weight, and billions of dollars in hidden debt came flooding back onto the primary ledger. The resulting earnings restatement wiped out $1.2 billion in shareholder equity in a single afternoon. Credit rating agencies downgraded the company to junk status. Trading partners demanded cash up front, which the company simply did not have. A desperate attempt at a leveraged buyout by a rival firm fell apart during due diligence once the true scale of the rot was uncovered. On December 2, 2001, the company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Tens of thousands of employees lost their jobs and their entire life savings, which had been locked in company stock. The executives claimed ignorance, insisting they were victims of a market panic, but internal emails revealed a psychological profile rooted in unchecked arrogance. They believed they were smart enough to rewrite the laws of economic gravity, and when gravity took hold, it pulled the entire system down. The devastation left deep scars on the financial world. Tens of thousands of families lost their homes. Retirees watched their pensions evaporate, and a profound, lingering cynicism settled over the global markets. Auditors had willingly signed off on the fiction, and regulators had chased shadows while white-collar predators looted the vault from the inside. In the bitter aftermath, governments enacted sweeping new laws, implemented stricter oversight, and promised the public that a corporate fraud of that magnitude could never happen again. But financial amnesia is a powerful and predictable force. Nearly 2 decades later and an ocean away, a new illusion was taking shape, operating on the exact same principles of unchecked arrogance and phantom revenue. This time, the stage was not set in the energy corridors of Texas, but in the affluent, meticulously ordered suburbs of Munich, Germany. The country was desperate for a homegrown technology champion, a digital powerhouse that could rival the titans of Silicon Valley. They found their undisputed savior in a payment processing company that promised to revolutionize global digital transactions. The German financial establishment is traditionally conservative, built on heavy engineering, automotive dominance, and a rigid adherence to protocol. Software, digital payments, and borderless e-commerce were largely foreign territory to the old guard of regulators at BaFin in Frankfurt. This cultural blind spot created the perfect incubator for a highly specialized kind of corporate predator, one who could hide behind the confusing jargon of financial technology. Wirecard did not start as a prestige asset. In the early 2000s, it was a gritty payment processor handling transactions for the dark corners of the internet, primarily offshore gambling and adult entertainment. Traditional banks wouldn't touch this money. Wirecard built its foundation on being the toll booth for high-risk, high-margin digital vice. Enter Marcus Braun, a former consultant who steps in as CEO, and John Marsalik, a shadowy operative who becomes chief operating officer. Together, they recognize a glitch in the global banking system. Braun drapes the high-risk payment processor in the sleek, impenetrable jargon of a modern fintech giant. Wearing black turtlenecks, he cultivates the aura of a visionary, pitching a frictionless future of digital payments. But the real innovation is in the accounting. Wirecard claimed to be expanding rapidly into Asia and the Middle East, processing digital payments for merchants worldwide and skimming a tiny fraction of a cent off every transaction. Because they lacked local banking licenses in these regions, they relied on a shadowy network of third-party acquirers. According to the public filings, these local partners processed transactions on Wirecard's behalf in places like Dubai, Singapore, and Manila. They supposedly held the funds in trust and reliably passed along the profits. It was an elegant, asset-light expansion strategy that Wall Street and European investors devoured without question. The glitch in the system was astonishingly simple, yet devastatingly effective. The vast majority of these third-party partners did not actually exist. To keep the illusion alive, Marsalek and his inner circle orchestrated a relentless industrial-scale campaign of document forgery across a ghost network of shell companies spanning from Dublin to Dubai. They created fake customer lists, fabricated transaction logs, and generated phony invoices to simulate billions of dollars in legitimate business volume. The procedural mechanics of the forgery were shockingly rudimentary for a company destined for a €24 billion valuation. They did not use sophisticated financial engineering. They used basic software to manipulate bank statements and forge signatures. To survive audit season, they engaged in round-tripping, moving small amounts of real cash back and forth to create the illusion of massive active corporate accounts. The audacity of the deception eventually scaled up to a staggering physical charade. The executives claimed that €1.9 billion of corporate cash, roughly a quarter of the company's entire balance sheet, was sitting safely in highly secure escrow accounts in the Philippines. To satisfy the increasingly suspicious auditors, they staged elaborate theatrical productions, hiring actors to pose as bank officials and setting up fake branch offices complete with counterfeit banking software. The central loophole that allowed this fiction to survive for over a decade was a systemic glitch in the global auditing process. Wirecard ruthlessly exploited the fragmented nature of international financial oversight. By compartmentalizing their audits, they ensured that the local auditors looking at the Asian subsidiaries never fully communicated with the group auditors in Germany. They weaponized the very complexity of the global financial system, turning jurisdictional boundaries into impenetrable walls that shielded their phantom revenue. The third-party acquiring business model was the ultimate camouflage. By claiming to outsource their payment processing in high-risk regions to local partners, Wirecard created a convenient black box. They argued that because they did not process the transactions directly, they did not hold the raw data. This allowed them to book massive, entirely fictionalized profit margins without triggering standard banking oversight or providing the granular transaction records that a traditional financial institution would be forced to produce. To validate these phantom billions, Wirecard relied on unregulated, obscure trustees in the Philippines. These individuals were paid to essentially vouch for the existence of the money. The catastrophic procedural failure occurred when top-tier auditors from EY accepted these flimsy, third-party confirmations instead of demanding direct, unmediated access to the bank accounts. For a decade, the prestigious accounting firm rubber-stamped Wirecard's books, relying on forged PDFs and screenshots of bank balances. The auditors treated forged letters from unknown trustees as gospel, prioritizing the client relationship over their fundamental fiduciary duty to verify reality. They knew that if you make the lie complex enough and the profits high enough, the gatekeepers will simply stop checking the locks. The true mystery was the nature of the missing capital. When forensic accountants and international liquidators began the monumental task of tracing the phantom funds, they realized the money was never stolen because it never existed in the first place. Wirecard had constructed a financial perpetual motion machine using fake profits to secure real loans. The true heist was not faking the revenue, but using that fake revenue to extract billions in real capital from global lenders, which was then funneled out the back door through dark money channels to fund shadow operations. While the 1.9 billion euros were a mirage, the real wealth that vanished was absolute. Creditors, bondholders, and banking syndicates were left fighting over a hollow shell, realizing the legitimate payment processing business could not even begin to cover the massive debts. The devastation cut intimately deep inside the Munich headquarters. Thousands of rank-and-file employees, software engineers, marketers, and compliance officers arrived at their desks to discover their equity was worthless and their employer was a global criminal syndicate. They had no visibility into the phantom partners operating in the shadows. Their professional reputations were instantly tainted by association, left to pack their desks under the glare of media spotlights as collateral damage in a boardroom heist. The physical environment of the headquarters transformed from a beacon of corporate success into a sterile staging ground for federal police. The sleek glass architecture and modern executive suites once used to dazzle investors were cordoned off as agents seized boxes of physical evidence and cloned hard drives. The stark contrast between the polished, high-tech facade and the crude, desperate criminality that occurred behind closed doors was palpable in every empty boardroom. Today, the former Wirecard headquarters stands as a silent monument to the greatest financial deception in modern European history. Liquidators comb through abandoned executive suites, archiving petabytes of internal communications. The physical spaces where Marcus Braun delivered his turtleneck-clad sermons on the future of digital payments are now dead zones, echoing only with the footsteps of investigators mapping out the anatomy of the fraud. The ghost of Wirecard continues to haunt the global financial system, a permanent reminder of the vulnerabilities engineered into modern capital markets. Somewhere in the shadow economy, the architects of the phantom billions remain out of reach. John Marsalek slipped through Belarus and vanished into the Russian intelligence apparatus, shielded by hostile networks and layers of encrypted anonymity. It stands as a chilling proof of concept for financial predators, a testament to how easily a compelling narrative can hijack the machinery of global finance, overriding empirical reality and leaving nothing but shattered trust and empty vaults in its wake. By 2018, Wirecard had achieved the impossible, replacing traditional banking stalwarts on the DAX 30. They were untouchable. When short sellers and investigative journalists began pointing out glaring inconsistencies in the balance sheets, Wirecard didn't just deny the allegations. They weaponized the state. In a staggering display of regulatory capture, the German financial watchdog, BaFin, actually banned short selling of Wirecard stock and filed criminal complaints against the journalists. The system designed to protect investors was actively shielding a massive corporate fraud, blinded by the desire for a homegrown European tech champion. The facade held until the sheer volume of the phantom money became impossible to manage. For years, auditors accepted basic, easily forged documents as proof of billions in cash, but when a specialized forensic team from KPMG was finally brought in by a panicked board, they did what previous auditors had failed to do for a decade. They demanded direct, independent confirmation from the banks in the Philippines, where the 1.9 billion euros were supposedly held in escrow. The response from the Bank of the Philippine Islands and BDO Unibank was catastrophic. Wirecard was not a client. The bank documents were crude forgeries. The money did not exist. It had never existed. The third-party acquiring business was a ghost ship, generating phantom revenue to cover massive systemic losses in the company's legitimate operations. The entire corporate structure was a house of cards built on manipulated PDFs and phantom partners. The implosion was absolute. Within days, Wirecard filed for insolvency. Marcus Braun was arrested, his billionaire status evaporating overnight as he faced charges of commercial gang fraud and market manipulation. But the climax of this heist required a getaway. John Marsalek, the architect of the Asian Ghost Network, boarded a private jet in Austria, vanishing into the airspace of Belarus and eventually disappearing into the shadow world of state protection in Russia. He remains one of the world's most wanted fugitives. The autopsy of Wirecard reveals a predatory mechanics of greed that exploited the very institutions meant to detect it. It wasn't just a failure of a single auditing firm or a single regulator. It was a collective delusion, a willingness by the financial establishment to suspend disbelief as long as the stock price kept climbing. The glitch remains patched for now, but the blueprint for phantom revenue and regulatory capture is permanently etched into the history of modern financial crime. The actual unraveling required forensic accountants to dismantle a labyrinth of digital forgeries. Investigators sifting through the servers found a staggering volume of fabricated escrow confirmations, backdated contracts, and manipulated transaction logs. The fraud was not a sophisticated algorithmic exploit, but a brute force assault on the auditing process itself. Fake trustees in the Philippines had simply signed whatever documents were placed in front of them, rubber stamping a massive illusion that auditors accepted at face value. As the forensic teams dug deeper, they discovered that the legitimate core business of Wirecard was bleeding cash. The phantom profits from the Asian third-party partners were entirely fictional, engineered on spreadsheets to mask the catastrophic losses occurring in plain sight. Every time the company reported record-breaking quarterly earnings, they were pulling numbers from thin air to feed a hungry market. The real money had long been siphoned off through obscure loans and unrecoverable investments, leaving behind an empty corporate shell. The consequences of this exposure triggered a global manhunt for Jan Marsalek. The former chief operating officer did not just flee a corporate scandal, he executed a geopolitical extraction. Using his deep, long cultivated ties with private militias and intelligence operatives, Marsalek bypassed standard border controls. He orchestrated a phantom flight to the Philippines to throw investigators off his scent while actually touching down in Minsk before crossing the border into the safety of Moscow. Marsalek transformed from a white-collar fugitive into a state-sponsored asset. Western intelligence agencies soon realized that the executive they had treated as a tech visionary was deeply embedded with Russian security services. The Wirecard collapse was no longer just a financial crime. It was a profound national security breach for Germany and the broader European banking sector. The payment processor that handled transactions for intelligence assets and federal agencies had been compromised from the top down. The emotional wreckage left by Marsalek's betrayal devastated thousands. Retail investors saw their life savings vaporized in a matter of hours as the stock plunged to near zero. Employees who had dedicated their careers to building what they believed was a national champion were left jobless and tainted by association. They had trusted a charismatic operator who promised them a revolution in digital finance, only to discover they were unwitting extras in a sprawling criminal enterprise. The psychological toll extended far beyond the immediate financial ruin. Marsalek had weaponized trust, using his charm and an aura of untouchable success to silence critics and intimidate whistleblowers. Those who had raised alarms internally were systematically targeted, surveilled by private investigators, and pushed out of the industry. The realization that this corporate sociopathy was rewarded for so long left a deep, lingering cynicism among those who survived the fallout. While Marsalek vanished into the shadows, Marcus Braun faced a very different reality. The architect of the Wirecard narrative chose not to run, perhaps believing his own fabricated reality right up until the handcuffs clicked shut. Braun anchored his defense on plausible deniability, attempting to cast himself as the tragic victim of a rogue operation orchestrated entirely by Marsalek. He insisted he was a visionary chief executive who had simply trusted the wrong deputies. This defense strategy required a suspension of disbelief that prosecutors were unwilling to grant. Braun had micromanaged the company for nearly 2 decades, signing off on the very financial statements that engineered the fraud. The narrative that a control-obsessed billionaire was entirely oblivious to the fact that half of his company's revenue did not exist was a tough sell. The courts began the meticulous process of holding the man at the top accountable for the rot at the foundation. The environment surrounding Braun shifted violently from the opulent boardrooms of Munich to the austere reality of a high-security detention facility. The bespoke suits and private jets were replaced by prison-issued clothing and a rigid institutional schedule. His world shrank from global roadshows and meetings with heads of state to a small concrete cell, a stark physical manifestation of the collapsed empire he once commanded. Inside the sterile, heavily guarded courtroom of Munich, the final act of the Wirecard saga plays out under harsh fluorescent lights. The space is dominated by towering stacks of evidence binders and the relentless scrutiny of federal prosecutors. Here, stripped of his corporate armor and the shield of a soaring stock price, Braun sits in silence. The tech visionary who promised to redefine the future of money is now just another defendant waiting for the legal system to measure the precise weight of his deception. The legal reckoning brings the internal mechanics of that deception into the harsh light of the judicial system. Prosecutors present mountains of digital evidence, dragging the phantom ledger into reality. Terabytes of encrypted messages and internal spreadsheets map out exactly how the executive team orchestrated a multi-decade illusion. The trial details the daily procedural grind of maintaining the fraud, from backdating contracts to coordinating fake escrow statements right before quarterly earnings calls. To understand how a massive corporate entity fabricates billions in revenue under the noses of global regulators, you have to look past the monster and examine the machinery of its credibility. There is a precise historical precedent for this specific breed of financial camouflage. On the evening of December 10th, 2008, inside a Manhattan penthouse, the architect of Wall Street's most exclusive investment firm looked at his two sons and confessed that their entire empire was a fiction. He called it one big lie. Within 24 hours, the FBI would be at his door, and the world would learn that $64 billion had simply vanished. This was the detonation of the largest Ponzi scheme in human history. But Bernard Madoff did not start in the shadows. He was a pioneer of electronic trading, a former non-executive chairman of the NASDAQ, and the head of a highly successful, entirely legitimate market-making business. That legitimate operation was the ultimate decoy. It provided the institutional prestige and the necessary regulatory cover required to operate a parallel, unregulated investment advisory fraud on the 17th floor of the Lipstick Building. Wirecard weaponized the exact same dual structure strategy. Forensic accountants sifting through the wreckage discovered that the legitimate processing side of the business was actually bleeding cash. It was entirely subsidized by the fabricated margins of shadow operations. The deception did not rely on a sophisticated algorithmic exploit. It relied on a structural glitch in global payment processing known as third-party acquiring. In regions where Wirecard lacked the regulatory licenses to process payments directly, they outsourced the work to local middlemen. Wirecard claimed these third-party partners, scattered across Dubai, Singapore, and the Philippines, were processing massive volumes of transactions on their behalf. These local shell companies supposedly took a commission and passed the remaining revenue back to Wirecard. On paper, these outsourced operations were a gold mine, generating half of the company's global revenue and nearly all of its corporate profit. But the profits from these shadow partners were never actually transferred to Wirecard's primary accounts in Germany. Instead, the company claimed the funds were being deposited into obscure Asian escrow accounts managed by independent trustees. This was the systemic blind spot. By parking the phantom revenue in foreign escrow, Wirecard effectively severed the audit trail. They weaponized the inherent friction of cross-border banking to mask a multi-billion-dollar vacuum. They did not need to produce actual cash flow to satisfy the regulators. They only needed to produce pieces of paper attesting that the cash existed. The reality was a phantom ledger. The partners were dummy companies. The transactions were fabricated. The escrow accounts were empty. This systemic failure was compounded by a corporate governance structure that prioritized aggressive expansion over basic fiduciary duty. Statutory auditors signed off on financial statements year after year, accepting rudimentary bank confirmations from obscure Asian branches as proof of massive cash reserves. The entire ecosystem of financial verification broke down, relying on a deeply flawed assumption that a publicly traded company holding a German banking license would not simply invent its core revenue streams out of thin air. The fortress began to crumble not from a regulatory probe, but from relentless financial journalism. When reporters at the Financial Times began publishing granular analyses of Wirecard's accounting irregularities, the corporate response was unprecedented in its hostility. Wirecard did not just issue standard public relations denials. They deployed a shadow network of private investigators, former intelligence officers, and hackers to surveil and intimidate the journalists and short sellers who dared to question the balance sheet. They framed the allegations as a coordinated market manipulation campaign, leveraging their status as a national champion to compel the German financial regulator, BaFin, to intervene. Driven by a nationalistic desire to protect a domestic tech titan capable of rivaling Silicon Valley, BaFin operated under a mandate of protection rather than suspicion. They actively pursued critics instead of the executives orchestrating the fraud, culminating in a breathtaking weaponization of state power. BaFin officially banned the short selling of Wirecard stock. Regulators allowed millions of phantom euros to flow through the financial system unchecked. The illusion held until the sheer scale of the fabricated revenue demanded an independent forensic audit. KPMG was brought in to verify the Asian escrow accounts. For months, they chased paper trails that led to empty offices in Manila and uncooperative trustees. When the final report was published, it was a devastating indictment of absence. KPMG stated they could not verify that the lion's share of Wirecard's profits had ever existed. This triggered the final fatal sequence of events. On June 18, 2020, the foundation of Europe's most celebrated financial technology empire cracked open. The company's longtime auditor, Ernst & Young, finally broke rank. EY refused to sign off on the annual corporate accounts, citing an elaborate and sophisticated fraud. They could not locate 1.9 billion euros, roughly $2.1 billion, representing a quarter of the company's entire balance sheet. The cash was supposedly sitting in those Philippine escrow accounts. But when pressed for verification, the banks in Manila delivered the kill shot. They had never heard of the company. The escrow documents and trustee letters were crude forgeries. The money was not misplaced. It simply did not exist. Within hours, a 24 billion euro valuation, nearly $30 billion, vaporized. The stock plunged by 80%, entering a terminal freefall. The loss wasn't just measured in wiped-out market capitalization. It was the total erosion of trust in the regulatory bedrock of the global market. The ultimate humiliation played out on the Frankfurt Stock Exchange, fundamentally altering the landscape of German finance. Wirecard was unceremoniously ejected from the DAX 30, the prestigious benchmark it had entered in 2018 after ousting the historic Commerzbank. It was an unprecedented disgrace, marking the first time in history that a member of the elite blue-chip index collapsed directly into insolvency under the weight of criminal fraud. As insolvency administrators descended on the corporate wreckage in Aschheim, a quiet suburb of Munich, the procedural nightmare began. Born in the dot-com ashes of 1999, Wirecard had engineered a reverse takeover to get listed on the exchange, selling a narrative of relentless growth driven by proprietary artificial intelligence. Now, inside the glass-walled corridors of the headquarters, the bustling energy of Europe's premier fintech darling was replaced by the cold efficiency of criminal investigators. The sleek executive suites, once the staging ground for audacious acquisitions across Asia and the Middle East, were crime scenes. The true architect of these shadow operations, Chief Operating Officer John Marsalek, simply vanished, while CEO Marcus Braun, a former KPMG consultant who projected the aura of a Silicon Valley visionary, provided the public veneer. Marsalek had operated in the dark, brokering the fraudulent deals. When the house of cards collapsed, Marsalek boarded a private jet and disappeared into the geopolitical ether, leaving behind an international manhunt and a trail of alleged ties to Russian intelligence. The fallout left a permanent scar on the reputation of global capital markets, destroying billions in legitimate shareholder wealth and wiping out the life savings of retail investors who trusted the system. While Braun faces the grinding machinery of the justice system, the ghost of Marsalic continues to haunt the investigation. The Wirecard saga stands as a definitive warning that in the modern financial era, the most dangerous weapon is a pristine, unaudited spreadsheet. They did not need to produce actual cash flow. They only needed to produce forged bank confirmations to keep the growth narrative alive. To understand how a systemic failure of this magnitude occurs, you have to look at the glitch in the architecture of global digital payments. In the early 2000s, Wirecard was surviving on the fringes of the internet economy, processing credit card transactions for online gambling and pornography. These were high-risk sectors. Traditional banks wouldn't touch them. Marcus Braun, a former consultant with a penchant for black turtlenecks and absolute control, took over as CEO and recognized a critical vulnerability in the market. He didn't just want to process payments, he wanted to build an impenetrable financial black box. A single press release drops in Munich, and a $24 billion European tech darling instantly vaporizes. Wirecard, the payment processor that was supposed to rival Silicon Valley, announces a slight delay in its annual report. The stated reason is a missing signature from their auditor, EY. The underlying reality is a missing 1.9 billion euros. The loss wasn't just in the billions, it was in the total erosion of trust in the global financial establishment. This was a digital fortress built entirely on phantom ledgers. The foundation of this deception was laid decades earlier in the gray margins of the internet. Wirecard didn't start by processing payments for blue-chip retailers. They built their infrastructure handling transactions for offshore casinos and unregulated adult entertainment sites, industries traditional banks refused to touch. Under the leadership of CEO Marcus Braun, a man who cultivated a visionary aura complete with black turtlenecks and pseudo-philosophical monologues, the company pivoted. They masked their high-risk origins beneath a veneer of sophisticated financial technology. Braun sold a narrative of relentless, exponential growth, and the market bought it. Wirecard absorbed smaller payment processors across the globe, expanding their footprint at a breakneck pace. Executives at Wirecard, Europe's most celebrated financial technology giant, are staring down auditors from Ernst & Young. For a decade, the numbers always added up. But today, a staggering 1.9 billion euros is missing. The funds are supposed to be sitting in 2 bank accounts in the Philippines. The bank documents are forged. The money simply does not exist. The loss here wasn't just in the billions, it was in the total erosion of trust across the entire European financial regulatory apparatus. Over the next 72 hours, a 24 billion euro corporate titan will evaporate, exposing one of the most audacious financial heists in modern history. To understand how a publicly traded company fakes a quarter of its balance sheet, you have to look at the glitch in the system they exploited. Wirecard didn't start as a darling of the DAX 30 index. It began in the late 90s, processing payments for the dark corners of the internet, primarily pornography and offshore gambling. These were high-risk transactions that traditional commercial banks refused to touch. Marcus Braun, a former KPMG consultant who took over as chief executive officer, saw a lucrative void. Alongside his enigmatic chief operating officer, John Marsalek, Braun aggressively pivoted the company. They wrapped this murky payment processing engine in the sleek, impenetrable vernacular of a Silicon Valley tech disruptor. They convinced the market they weren't just moving money. They were building a revolutionary software ecosystem. On the morning of June 18, 2020, the board of Wirecard, Europe's most celebrated financial technology company, faced an impossible mathematical reality. Auditors from EY had spent months chasing a ghost through the global banking system. 9 billion euros, supposedly sitting in 2 escrow accounts in the Philippines. The banks in Manila finally responded. The accounts did not exist. The documents were forged. The loss wasn't just the 1.9 billion on paper or the 24 billion euros in market capitalization that evaporated in a matter of days. It was the total erosion of trust in the regulatory firewall of the European financial establishment. Wirecard did not begin as a titan of the DAX index. It started in the late 90s, operating in the gray margins of the internet economy. When traditional financial institutions refused to touch the payment processing for online gambling and adult entertainment, Wirecard stepped into the void. They identified a lucrative glitch in the early digital economy. High-risk merchants needed to move money, and they were willing to pay exorbitant transaction fees for a processor that did not ask questions. On June 18, 2020, the executive board of Germany's most celebrated technology company gathered in a Munich boardroom to confront an impossible mathematical reality. 1.9 billion euros, roughly a quarter of the company's entire balance sheet, simply did not exist. The money wasn't stolen. It hadn't been embezzled or lost in a bad trade. It was a phantom, conjured from thin air to prop up a lie that had fooled the world's most sophisticated institutional investors for over a decade. This was the sudden, catastrophic evaporation of Wirecard. To understand how a $24 billion corporate titan was built on absolute nothingness, you have to look at the architecture of modern digital finance. Wirecard didn't break into a vault. They found a glitch in the system of international payment processing. They operated as a middleman handling digital transactions for merchants. But to operate in regions where they lacked proper banking licenses, like Asia and the Middle East, they relied on outsourced partners known as third-party acquirers. This was the blind spot. It is June 18, 2020. The auditors from Ernst & Young have just delivered the fatal blow. 9 billion euros, roughly a quarter of the company's entire balance sheet, cannot be located. The money is not in the trust accounts in the Philippines. The banks in Manila have no record of the funds. The letters of confirmation are crude forgeries. Within hours, a $30 billion tech titan will evaporate. The loss wasn't just in the billions, it was in the total erosion of trust, exposing a massive, deliberate blind spot in the heart of the European financial system. To understand how Wirecard, a payment processor built on the fringes of online gambling and pornography, infiltrated the DAX 30, you have to look at the architecture of digital transactions. Wirecard wasn't a traditional bank, it was a conduit. When a customer swiped a card, Wirecard processed the payment, taking a fraction of a cent. But the real money, the explosive, market-defying growth, came from what they called third-party acquiring. The Munich headquarters of Europe's most celebrated financial technology company is suffocating in a deafening silence. The auditors from Ernst & Young have just refused to sign off on the annual accounts. 9 billion euros, supposedly sitting in trust accounts in the Philippines, cannot be located. The loss wasn't just in the billions, it was in the total erosion of trust. a fatal blow to a regulatory system that had spent a decade looking the other way. Within days, a corporate titan valued at 24 billion euros will be reduced to penny stock, its CEO behind bars, and its chief operating officer an international fugitive. The anatomy of this collapse begins in the murky margins of the early internet. Long before it was the pride of the DAX index, Wirecard carved out a highly profitable, high-risk niche processing credit card payments for online casinos and adult entertainment sites. It was the plumbing of the shadow economy. When Marcus Braun, a former KPMG consultant, took the helm as CEO, he recognized that legitimate institutional capital demanded a cleaner narrative. He draped the company's high-risk operations in the sleek, impenetrable language of artificial intelligence and global fintech disruption. But a tech narrative requires exponential growth, and organic growth in payment processing is a brutal, low-margin grind. So, Wirecard found a glitch in the global financial architecture. They called it third-party acquiring. On June 18, 2020, auditors at EY were forced to admit a mathematical impossibility. 1.9 billion euros, roughly a quarter of the total balance sheet of Europe's most celebrated financial technology empire, simply did not exist. The cash was supposed to be sitting in two trustee accounts in the Philippines. But when bank officials in Manila were finally pressed, they confirmed the escrow certificates were crude forgeries. The loss wasn't just in the billions. It was in the total erosion of trust in a sovereign regulatory system that had spent a decade shielding a criminal enterprise from the truth. This was the sudden, violent implosion of Wirecard. To understand how a payment processor built on clearing transactions for offshore gambling and adult entertainment hijacked the global financial establishment, you have to look at the mechanics of the deception. When Marcus Braun took over as CEO in 2002, Wirecard was surviving on the high-risk fringes of e-commerce. Braun engineered a pivot. Wielding the sterile, confident vocabulary of a Silicon Valley visionary, he positioned Wirecard as a frictionless digital ecosystem. The market bought the narrative, but the actual revenue engine was a masterpiece of shadow banking, orchestrated largely by his chief operating officer, Jan Marsalek. The Munich headquarters of Europe's most celebrated fintech giant is paralyzed. Executives are scrambling. The auditors from EY have just refused to sign off on the annual accounts. $2.1 billion, supposedly sitting in escrow accounts in the Philippines, simply does not exist. The loss wasn't just in the billions, it was in the total erosion of trust across the entire European financial system. This was the moment a two-decade illusion shattered, revealing a predatory machine built on phantom revenue, forged documents, and a regulatory blind spot so massive it allowed a digital payment processor to orchestrate one of the most audacious corporate frauds in modern history. To understand how Wirecard hijacked the DAX index and fooled global markets, you have to look at the glitch they exploited. The company didn't start as a darling of the tech world. It began in the late 90s, processing payments for the dark corners of the internet, specifically online gambling and adult entertainment. When Marcus Braun, a former KPMG consultant, took the helm as CEO, he recognized a structural vulnerability in global finance. High-risk transactions required a complex web of intermediaries to bypass strict banking controls. Braun positioned Wirecard as the ultimate middleman. They acquired a German banking license, effectively merging a tech startup with a regulated financial institution. This dual identity was the masterstroke. It allowed them to issue credit cards, process transactions, and operate with the veneer of strict German regulatory oversight, while hiding their true mechanics offshore. A routine Thursday in Munich shatters when Ernst & Young refuses to sign off on the annual audit of Europe's most celebrated financial technology firm. 1.9 billion euros, roughly a quarter of the company's entire balance sheet, is simply gone. This is the moment Wirecard, a 24 billion euro titan, stops being a tech darling and becomes the scene of one of the most audacious accounting heists in modern history. Marcus Braun did not build Wirecard from the ground up. He inherited a murky payment processor handling transactions for online gambling and adult entertainment, and he sanitized it. Braun draped the company in the sleek, sterile aesthetics of Silicon Valley. He sold a narrative of frictionless digital transactions, positioning Wirecard as the indispensable bridge between consumers and merchants. But beneath the polished corporate veneer lay a mechanical exploit, a glitch in the architecture of global payments that Braun and his chief operating officer, Jan Marsalek, would leverage to manufacture a phantom empire. The Munich headquarters of Europe's most celebrated financial technology empire is paralyzed. For a decade, Wirecard was the untouchable titan of the DAX 30. A 24 billion euro behemoth that promised to digitize the global economy. The auditors at EY refused to sign off on the annual accounts. 1.9 billion euros, roughly a quarter of the company's entire balance sheet, simply does not exist. The loss wasn't just in the billions. It was in the total erosion of trust, exposing a catastrophic failure of corporate governance, regulatory oversight, and basic financial reality.